Workshop 5. Writing the introduction and method sections of a project report. You may wonder why, at this point in time, we are dealing already with the issue of writing parts of a report. The answer is very simple, because even if you have not yet collected the data for your project, you already have all the information required in order to write the introduction of your project report and the method section, except for some pieces of information that you still don't know. For example, the sample size and the characteristics of your sample. But except for these little pieces or little bits of information, you can already now start writing the introduction and method sections of your project report. So let's see the goals we have in this screencast. The key goal is to understand what it takes to write an excellent introduction and method sections of your psychology project report. This is broken down in two sub-goals. First, to understand the basic requirements for earning a pass grade. Second, to understand the typical shortfalls of projects that are good, meaning they are in the C+, B+ range, but not excellent. They are not A-, A, or A+. And by clarifying the second point, our goal is to identify the key targets for achieving excellence. Let's start then with the basic requirements. Formatting and style. The worldwide accepted guide to writing papers in the field of psychology is the American Psychological Association 2009 Publication Manual of the American Psychological Association. Now we follow the APA guide for virtually every aspect of formatting and style, except for a few irrelevant details that depart a little from the APA guide. APA formatting and writing style is the core requirement for earning a pass grade. And you will also need to study carefully the document Assessment Criteria for Project Report, L6, which is available on WebLearn, because markers will use those criteria to mark your final project report. The assessment criteria also contain all the information you need to understand the small departures that are required from the American Psychological Association Publication Manual. Let's look at the structure of research reports. First, there is a title page. The title is the advertisement of the study. Then there is the abstract, which is a mini version of your report. Then, for the project report, we have a press release, which provides the bottom line for the general public. You normally don't see a press release in APA journals. This is a requirement for the psychology project at London Met. Then there is the introduction section, which presents the theoretical background and the research hypothesis or plural hypotheses. Then there is the method section, which presents everything the researcher and the participants did to produce the data for the analysis. The method section is typically divided in subsections, in particular participants, materials / measures, and procedure. Then there is the results section, which presents all the evidence pertaining the research hypothesis, and singular or plural, and their test. Then there is the discussion section, which presents an evaluation of a research hypothesis in relation to the theory and the prior research conducted in the area, and provides the bottom line answer to the question, what have we learned by conducting this research? Then there is the references section, and then there will be appendices. Let's start with a title. The title indicates the nature of the research reported. It should be concise but informative enough to give the reader an accurate idea of the investigator's central concerns. Should not be longer than one sentence of 12 words. This is an APA rule. As a matter of fact, this rule is not enforced strictly for the psychology report, but in general, it's a very good practice if you do not write a very long title. Usually, the title simply states the dependent and independent variables in the study. For example, the effect of alcohol consumption on the ability to drive. You may have a longer title, a strange title for your project proposal. Well, no problem. If the title of your project proposal does not satisfy these requirements, just change it for the final report. Abstract. The abstract is a single paragraph summarizing the main points of a report. Single paragraph means a single paragraph, so you shouldn't have any carriage return. For APA journals, normally the abstract is only 120 words. Here, for the psychology project, you are required to write an abstract which is in between 150 and 200 words. It covers the issue being investigated, the design used, the participants involved, the principal results obtained and their analysis, and the main conclusions drawn from the research. It basically includes a summarizing sentence from each section of a report. Therefore, the abstract is not so easy to write. And it makes sense that you write the abstract after writing the whole report. The press release. This section is a requirement for the psychology project, but is not a requirement for APA journal articles. Why did we decide to have this section, this additional section? Fundamentally because we would like you to be able to present your psychology project to people other than psychologists. Once you are finished with your studies and you look for a job or you apply for further studies. The press release should be in between 150 and 200 words, and it communicates the take-home and real-life value of the study and its findings to a large audience of known psychologists. Here you can have several paragraphs. It is not an abstract. The abstract is directed to an audience of psychologists. The press release is directed to a large audience of known psychologists. The goal is therefore to get the general reader engaged and interested in learning more about the study. Here you are not talking to the specialist, you're talking to the general reader. Let's now look at a fun example of press release. Here we have a paper published in 2017 in a Journal of Applied Psychology, which is an APA journal. The title is "Can Supersmart Leaders Suffer from Too Much of a Good Thing? The Curvilinear Effect of Intelligence on Perceived Leadership Behavior." Now, we can understand a bit what this paper is all about, but in order to understand better, we need to look at the abstract. Here we see In the first sentence, we talk about nonlinear functions. And when we say we examined if a relation between intelligence, IQ, and perceived leadership might be more accurately described by a curvilinear single-picked function. Quite complicated. Okay, I leave it to you, but this shows you something that the non-psychologist and even a psychologist would have a bit of a hard time to understand. So let's look then at how the BPS advertised this study and explained this study. So this is a press release by the BPS. Let's start with a title. Very intelligent people make less effective leaders according to their peers and subordinates. Now already from the title we start understanding something about this study. Let's look at the style of this press release by the BPS. Okay. Highly intelligent people tend to make good progress in the workplace and are seen as fit for leadership roles. Overall, smarter is usually associated with success. Premise. But if you examine the situation more closely, as does new research in the Journal of Applied Psychology, you find evidence that too much intelligence can harm leadership effectiveness. Too clever for your own good? Let's look at the research. This is a very engaging first paragraph. And we can stop here. You can read this review, this press release by yourself and appreciate the good style of the BPS. Let's next look at how the general press reported the same study. Here we are looking at Newsweek magazine. The title is already very interesting. Good news, Donald Trump. You don't have to be very smart to be a good leader. Let's see how they go about telling the story of his scientific study. Okay, there is a nice picture of Donald Trump, a US president. It is often suggested by Donald Trump's critics that because he makes spelling mistakes, he can't always remember names, grasp the finer points of traditional diplomacy, delete as applicable, he must be a bad leader. But new research could bring good news for the president. A new study published in the Journal of Applied Psychology posits that it's possible for leaders to be too intelligent. And here Newsweek refers to the press release of the British Psychological Society. And they say, according to a summary on the British Psychological Society website, John Antonakis at the University of Lausanne, working alongside colleagues, signed up 379 mid-ranking leaders in a range of 30 private companies, most of them European. And then the article goes on explaining the meaning. It's also very interesting that Newsweek did not refer to the journal article directly, but to the summary presented by the British Psychological Society. This illustrates the concept of levels of language and levels of understanding. The journal article is a tough cookie to read and understand. It is something that only psychologists and psychology with certain levels of competence can fully appreciate and understand. The BPS has done a great job in explaining this to a large audience of people interested in psychology. And Newsweek has done a fantastic job in presenting the idea to the ordinary public. So this illustrates the type of work you have to do. You have to think of your project report as a whole and give a bottom line for the general public in a fun, convincing, and faithful way. Let's now move to the introduction. The introduction presents the background and purpose of the investigation, and it sells the research hypothesis to the reader. The fact that it sells the research hypothesis, it means it has to be convincing, and it has to be interesting. It flows from general to more specific issues, so it's progressive. It states the general problem examined in the paper. It briefly reviews the relevant literature in order to show the current state of the subject and put the investigation in context. Basically, in the introduction, you have to present the goals of your study and explain why your study will constitute a significant contribution to science. It could be just a very small contribution, but you have to make it extremely clear what your contribution is all about. And typically this is achieved because there are holes or faults in the existing literature that you will be the first one to tackle. It could be a little hole, a little fault, a little uncertainty, a little ambiguity, but you will be the first one to tackle that problem. And you have to explain it very clearly in the introduction. You have to sell your project as a contribution to knowledge, a contribution that potentially overcomes some limitations of prior research. Finally, in the introduction, you should state the research hypothesis or plural hypotheses that will be tested. If you have more than one hypothesis, separate and number them progressively. This will be extremely useful when you mention them in the results and discussion section, because instead of repeating the hypothesis over and over again, you can just call them H1, H2, and H3, and so forth, so that you don't waste words against the total word count for introduction and discussion. Express each hypothesis properly using the future tense. Let's now move to the method section. The method section explains what researcher and participants did, and it enables someone else to replicate the research. So basically, a good method section allows any other researcher to replicate the study perfectly. The method section is divided in 3 subsections. The participants subsection reports total number of participants and number of participants per condition of independent variable, how the participants were recruited, relevant characteristics of the participants, for example, mean age, age range, and sex distribution. The materials or measures subsection describes the stimuli, for example, word lists, questionnaires used, tests. The procedure subsection presents a precise account of the actions undertaken by both the researcher and the participants, including ethics. If a study has a complex ethics issue, then you may like to have a separate section just for ethics. Let's now move on beyond just the basic pass grade and let's identify key targets for excellence. And we start with the introduction section. First paragraph of the introduction should be broad and engaging. Here is an example from the winner of a Tom Walsh Award for Diploma Projects in the year 2012-13. Europe is considered the oldest continent in the world and it is believed to be growing older. as birth rates are dropping and the life expectancy is rising, new challenges present themselves in many European societies. Due to the changes in the demographics, there will be a larger proportion of people not working than working, which means the current labor practices and policies may need to be reviewed. So the student here is doing a very good job in setting the background for the investigation. Let's see what the investigation is all about, and we will know it by the end of this paragraph. A large amount of research has been conducted on ways to retain employees longer. So because the population is getting older, we cannot retire people any longer. We will have to consider keeping them at work for longer. So strategies have included further training opportunities, financial incentives, and opportunities for flexible employment, including, for example, part-time work. As most studies have focused on external factors affecting the likelihood of retaining qualified employees longer, the current study will draw on flow theory from the field of positive psychology and look at internal factors relevant for senior employee retention. So now, by the end of this paragraph, we have been oriented. We know what the general context is and what roughly has been done on the issue. There is a limitation highlighted here that previous research has focused mostly on external factors affecting the likelihood of retaining qualified employees longer. So this study, we already know, is tackling a limitation of prior research by focusing on internal factors. Now, you should note that references are used also for general statements, and you will notice that here a reference is missing. One or two references, for example, with EG before them would have been useful to indicate journal articles or other sources in which external factors were examined. And another thing to notice is that the last statement of this paragraph introduces nicely the present study. Then the rest of the introduction has to be made of well interconnected paragraphs. There should be flow in writing and therefore in reading. This is a very good example from a past project of flow in the interconnection of paragraphs. For example, let's look at the first paragraph. Berry's acculturation model is based on the premise that there are two key issues at the heart of acculturation. Firstly, the degree to which immigrants maintain their original culture, and secondly, the extent to which they have contact with and participate in the host society. Based on this bidimensional concept, Berry proposed 4 acculturation strategies that immigrants can adopt: integration, assimilation, separation, and marginalization. And now we already know what will happen in the next paragraph. The next paragraph will deal with integration, and the following paragraph will deal with assimilation, and so forth. So this is a very good organization of text. The writing should be concise and well filled in with references. Let's look at a real example of a paper written with 2 students. The first author of this paper, a master student, gave me a very long first paragraph. It's very long and is definitely not concise, and many references are missing. Let's start with an array of factors underlying juvenile offending behavior have been widely discussed and defended. Why discussed and defended? By theorists and researchers. What's the difference between theorists and researchers? In a range of fields, through a factor which has prevailed within psychological and criminological investigations, is social influence. So, let's look at what we can do to make this first paragraph readable. Purging. Here we start cutting quite a lot. An array of factors underlying juvenile offending behavior has been discussed, and a factor which has prevailed within psychological and criminological investigations is social influence. And here the comment is list references, and so forth. But after accepting these changes and adding the references, starts looking a bit better. An array of factors underlying juvenile offending behavior has been discussed, and a factor which has prevailed within psychological and criminological investigations is social influence, but still add references here. Finally, the first paragraph becomes just 71 words. Psychological and criminological investigations looking at social influence have made important contributions to current understanding of juvenile antisocial behavior. Ooh, it feels so much better now. Bandura's social learning theory helped develop the concept of a role model through his studies on children, showing that exposure to aggressive peer models fosters subsequent aggressive behavior. The potential for social influence has then extended to encompass the impersonal presence of the media. Then this paragraph is followed by two paragraphs: research on personally known role models and research on media role models. So we have now simplified the text, shortened it, divided it into 3 paragraphs, and it's much more readable. Let's now consider the issue of clarity and elegance. Sometimes the two clash, and we should always prefer clarity over elegance. This is because we are in science, not in poetry. Variety of words can make text refined and tasteful in appearance, but it is confusing. So do not use different terms for the same concept. That is confusing. Look at this excerpt from a journal reviewer's report on a paper which was submitted and was playing this trick of using different words, different terms to refer to the same construct. And the comment of the reviewer is, this paragraph is very confusing. For one, it was not immediately clear to me the multiple terms used by the authors refer to the same variable. For example, running velocity, pacing values, and advancement speed. So, always choose clarity over elegance, and once you call a construct with a name, stick to that name from beginning to end of a report. Strong rationale. Strong rationale for the research question, the research hypothesis, and hence the study as a whole. Here are some comments from external examiners who looked at good project reports, that is, project reports that were good but not excellent. Let's see what they had to say. all literature reviews were good, but specific links between the literature and hypotheses were often weaker. Consequently, hypotheses were often a little vague. For example, one student proposed mediational and moderating relationships between the same variables within the same hypothesis. So there was a confusion in the formulation of hypotheses. Students often did not make good links between the literature review and the hypothesis they were proposing. Finally, we should encourage project students to think harder about the links between their literature review and their hypothesis. Let's go a bit deeper into this. My advice is, do not write a literature review as a standalone, contemplative, and decontextualized piece. Write a purposeful and contextualized review of a literature that is intended from its inception to support your hypothesis. In other words, the main purpose of a literature review is to provide the conceptual elements that you will combine to provide a strong rationale for your hypothesis. You're making a case. You're not describing reality. You are presenting theoretical and empirical evidence in order to convince the reader that your hypothesis is meaningful and worth testing. The stronger the rationale, the higher the grade. What does make a rationale strong? But the argument is clear, well-grounded in prior research, and logical. The hypothesis follows naturally from the argument to the extent that you can rightfully state, therefore, the following hypothesis is posited. If you say therefore, it means that the hypothesis follows naturally from the argument that you have just presented. It is convincing as much as an attorney's closing argument or a business offer that cannot be refused. Let's see an example here from a paper of mine. In this paragraph we have, first, a recap of key points of a literature review. A key prediction of Wells and Matthews' theory of psychological dysfunction is that compared with individuals who score low on maladaptive metacognitive traits, individuals who score high on maladaptive metacognitive traits are more likely to adopt maladaptive coping strategies when facing a problematic situation. Metacognition is theorized to foster maladaptive coping both in respect to internal states, that is, negative emotion, and in respect to the environment, that is, presumed or real threats that trigger negative emotion. So this is a summary of the literature review. Now we develop the argument. In particular, metacognition might be a factor that predisposes to drinking in order to cope with negative emotion. As such, the association between metacognition and alcohol dependence should be stronger for individuals with more metacognition. And at that point, we can say, therefore, the following hypothesis is posited. So we have a formula here for a good or strong rationale. First, a recap plus the argument, followed by therefore, the following hypothesis is posited, and the hypothesis formulated using future tense and numbered. In this case, it was H3. Let's now move to the key targets for excellence concerning the method section. The first rule is to have a neat separation of content across subsections. Excellent reports show a clear-cut separation of contents across the subsections of a method section. This is particularly hard to achieve in experimental studies. The project proposal submitted to date contained quite a bit of content spilling across subsections, so the implication for you is, therefore, when you write a method section, do not just copy and paste from your project proposal. You can use that text as a basis, but you have to focus on the separation of content across subsections. Let's look at an example. This is a Year 1 practical report that earned a A+ grade. Participants: 40 undergraduate students from the University of Sussex, aged between 20 and 25 years, with a mean age of 22, participated in the experiment. There were 7 males and 33 females. Participation was on a voluntary basis. The participants were equally assigned to each of the 2 experimental conditions. 20 participants were assigned to the personal identity condition and 20 to the social identity condition. Clear, complete, for a Year 1 practical report. Materials. The USIS underground station evacuation simulation was used to simulate an emergency situation. The USIS is a computer program that recreates a virtual emergency evacuation situation at an underground station. It employs computer game technology and so on. 2 scenarios of the same simulation were used, one for personal identity condition and one for the social identity condition, only differing in the introduction text presented at the beginning of the experiment. The virtual evacuation was presented on consecutive PowerPoint slides. Here we have the instructions appearing as separate slides, and after providing the instructions, the student clarifies that this text conveys the idea that participants are evolving in a mass of strangers and is hence designed not to create a sense of affiliation. Now this is done very well, except for "no bullets please." Here each one of the statements should have been put in quotes and without bullets. Here there is the description for the other condition, the social identity condition. And you see here clarity versus elegance. The student could have preferred elegance and hence not repeating the same structure as for the previous condition. But she preferred to go for clarity, and this is excellent. But again, no bullets please. Procedure. Wow. This you can read it by yourself, but it's very, very clear. You see, what is important here to note is that the procedure is very separate from the materials. Complete description means replicability. Now, the participant section of a Year 1 project report was very brief. Now, your reports require more completeness. Here we have a good example participant section by the winner of a Tom Walsh Award for Diploma Projects 2011 and 12. So a convenient sample of 193 adults took part in the study. Participants were recruited through personal contacts of the 4 researchers. All participants were required to be in full-time or part-time employment at the time of the study. Inclusion criteria: participants did not receive any financial compensation. Now, this participant section is a bit of a combination of participants and procedure, which is appropriate in correlation of studies. The sample consisted of 85 males and 108 females, but when you see how much more information is provided, this is fundamental for replicating the study. When it comes to describing the measure of a study, here we see again a very complete description of the instruments with examples of items. Divided in two paragraphs. In the second paragraph, the student describes the actual scale, the COPE R. The first paragraph describes the previous version of the same scale called COPE. And here the student explains very well the psychometric properties of a COPE R instrument with reference to reliability and validity and its superiority in respect to the original COPE scale. So excellent job here. It's time to wrap it up. In conclusion, for what concerns the introduction and method sections, earning a pass grade, grading between D and D+, requires a careful adherence to APA format and style of writing. Earning a good grade in the range C, B+, requires much more effort and outcome, a good research idea, powerful and concise writing, and flow in writing. Earning an excellent grade in the range A-, A+, requires formidable effort and outcome, in-depth evaluation of sources, strong rationale, and perfect study replicability. Therefore, start writing the introduction and method sections now. The more you wait, the more difficult it will be to achieve excellence in the writing of the introduction and method sections. Moreover, if you write the introduction and method sections now, you will have much more time available for analyzing the data when you have them and writing the other sections of a report. So everything you do now, you will not have to do it later, and you will have more cognitive resources in the future to devote to the other sections of a report. That's it.